Good morning and good afternoon for those who follow us from other parts of the world. Thank you for joining us in this event. México Evalúa is grateful for the opportunity of presenting the ninth edition of our report, Hallazgos, Assessment of the Criminal Justice System in Mexico. For 10 years, we have sought to inform the public debate around criminal justice in Mexico and produce quality information on its operation and results for both citizens and decision makers. Furthermore, we have sought to contribute to the improvement of our criminal justice institutions for the greater good of society. I wish to highlight that it is the second time that we present an English version of Hallazgos. This reflects our greatest interest in broadening our audience. We believe that now, more than ever, it is crucial to develop transnational learning communities that are eager to learn with us on how to overcome the barriers that still separate us from having criminal justice systems that are actually just. Given the Mexican context, where criminal justice institutions frequently operate isolated, even favoring partisan or political interests, Hallazgos underscores the basic assumption that criminal justice should operate as a system. Criminal justice is not the sum of its parts. It is, or should be, a set of complex and virtuous interactions among prosecutors, police officers, judges, public defenders, and victim advisors working to ensure truth and justice. With a public policy lens, Hallazgos aims, among other things, to provide evidence to nourish our discussions in the field and provide inputs for the decision makers. We are convinced that the possibility of improving the system depends on decision makers and judicial operators' will and capacity to take this evidence and transform it into actions, improved processes, and more importantly, solutions. Our report, along with its 9 previous editions, provides the longest historical series of data and analysis on the performance of the criminal justice system in Mexico since the implementation of the adversarial justice paradigm started back in 2008. Some of our main findings are the following. First one, criminal justice institutions barely collaborate among each other. Planning and budgeting are not addressed with a systemic logic. Coordination is scarce or non-existent. Our national ranking consolidation of the criminal justice system shows that those states who make some progress are those who have been able to develop systemic and public policy approaches to the criminal justice system. Despite the formal implementation of the adversarial justice system, in general, operators continue to work under old paradigms. Criminal investigations are still perceived as a mere formality. Prosecutors conform to low standards. Pretrial detentions continues to be extensively used. The public defense and victim advisory services are still under-resourced. At the same time, the power of the military through the National Guard continues to grow, while civic services are reduced and weakened. The flaws and failures of the system generate almost absolute, and we must say socially unsustainable levels of impunity. For the first time in years, we calculated impunity for a set of high impact crimes, Mexico Evalúa was able to show that serious crimes, such as intentional homicide, disappearance, or rape, remain practically unsolved. I wish to conclude these remarks by thanking some of who have supported our work for years. Our sincere gratitude goes to the United States Agency for International Development. Throughout the years, you have believed in our work. I am confident to say that thanks to that support, Hallazgos has become the most important public policy evaluation of the criminal justice system in Mexico. And with great pleasure, I would like to give the floor to Anders Mantius, Governance and Human Rights Deputy Director for Mexico of the USAID. Thank you. Thank you, Anders, for being here with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Buenos dias a todos y todas. Hi, everyone. It's really an honor for me to be here with you all, and a huge thank you to Mexico Evalúa and everyone else on the line for your time. Hallazgos over the last 9 years has become a benchmark analysis of Mexico's criminal justice system and has become an extremely important reference for state justice operators and civil society in Mexico. USAID is very happy to support Mexico Evalúa in its efforts for several years now, specifically now for the second English edition of Hallazgos. And this effort will expand the reach of the publication to international audiences that are also interested in understanding and improving Mexico's justice system. Data-driven decision-making is a key element in USAID's approach to deliver people-centered justice. Understanding some of the challenges, opportunities, and best practices in justice systems really can bring better outcomes and better services to end users and the broader public. These efforts also support transparent governance systems and help public institutions like Mexico's justice system overall improve the accountability in the country. I know Mexico Evalúa is also working to make sure these evaluations are more user-friendly and that their data is digestible to non-technical experts and just has overall broader applicability in Mexico. And so that's really exciting to see these reports becoming more and more useful across many different levels within the country. USAID will continue to support improvements in the criminal justice system and promote transparency in institutions in the region and in Mexico. And again, just quickly to wrap up, a huge thank you to Mexico Evalúa and everyone else here for your time. I really hope you enjoy this presentation. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Anders. Very nice to hear that word. You recognize our effort, and I think that, as you said, we are willing, and it is our aim to reach broader audiences, and we are working in creating materials and arguments that can make this objective possible. Thank you very much. I also wish to thank the generous support of the Frederick Naumann Foundation. They have also supported our research and advocacy efforts in this field. So thank you very much. And our sincere thanks also go to authorities who have collaborated proactively with Mexico Evalúa by making their information available for public scrutiny and analysis. We recognize their openness and interest in improving criminal justice, despite the efforts that have been made at the highest level of federal government to cancel sources of public information and undermine civil society efforts to monitor institutions. Mexico Evalúa is firmly convinced, we are really very convinced, that public scrutiny is crucial to improve justice and the quality of services offered to citizens. To discuss our report's findings, we are honored to be accompanied by 3 experts. I'm going to present them to you. Douglas Keillor, He is the founder and executive director of Juvenile Justice Advocates International. Since 2012, he has been working to create sustainable alternatives to detention for children who experience the criminal justice system in Latin America. Annalinda Gröning, she is a professor in criminal law at the University of Bergen, Norway. Since 2019, she leads the Permanent Expert Commission on Criminal Law Reforms in Norway. She is also a senior researcher at the Center for Research and Education in Forensic Psychiatry and Psychology in the Haukeland University Hospital in Bergen. Thank you very much, Annalinda. Thank you, Douglas and David. It is a pleasure for me to present you. He is the director of the Justice in Mexico initiative at the University of San Diego. He has served as a policy advisor and expert witness on matters concerning crime and violence, judicial reform, and human rights issues in Mexico. Thank you very much for your participation. And now I will give the floor to Christel Rosales, the coordinator of the Justice Program at México Evalúa, and she will present our report's main findings. You have the floor, Christel.
Thank you very much, Edna. Thanks to our donors, and thanks to the whole team of Mexico Evalúa who made possible this study. Good morning and good afternoon to all who are with us and who have given a time to analyze what's happening with the criminal justice in Mexico, what it means to talk about impunity, what are some of the determinants, factors associated, and above all, from a comparative perspective, those bets that can represent strategic changes in justice. Today, we are gathered to give us that opportunity. And for this, we will have extraordinary voices that can guide us in that conversation. But before doing so, I will briefly seek to present you some of the main findings of the assessment. But first of all, 3 premises of the study. The first one, we start from the assumption that criminal justice must be analyzed from a systemic approach, considering the different institutions and their relationships. Second, public safety or public security and criminal justice is not a zero-sum game between the rights of victims and accused, but both must be privileged to satisfy due process. And finally, we don't understand justice as the equivalence of a punishment or imprisonment, but rather the possibility of clarifying the facts, imposing sanctions, and mainly repairing the damages. Okay, let's start with our findings. First of all, what's the national context? From the logic of a criminal policy in terms of public security, we need to analyze crime rates, where the crimes are taking place, who are the most affected, how are these market logics economically sustained. In Mexico, we see criminal phenomena which is becoming more sophisticated, with structures, and we can say markets, criminal markets. And on the other hand, we see public institutions that don't talk to each other, that continue its operation in an inertial trend, and that end up without responding effectively, not even to common criminality, much less to the most complex one. Let's see what we mean. Mexico is going through a delicate context of violence and absence of state throughout the national territory. 2 main elements to consider. First, we start from a mistrust in the institutions of justice. More than 33% of victims of crime didn't report it because they considered it a waste of time, and almost 15% for distrusting authority. The dark figure of crimes not reported or not investigated remains at 93% without having changed even 1 percentage point in more than a decade. Among the crimes that are least reported are various property crimes, but also crimes such as kidnapping or rape. Even with this volume of cases that are not known or registered by the authorities, the levels of registered crimes have increasing trends. We are back to pre-pandemic levels, and there is no real effort to prevent and contain those crimes. The main increases can be seen in cases of rape, family violence, and human trafficking. Added to this, lethal violence remains at high levels with a rate of 28 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And about the disappearance phenomena, we have a rate of 80 disappeared persons per 100,000. About the budget allocation, from 2020 to 2021, only an increase of 0.07% was observed in spending directed to the criminal justice system, which is responsible for 98% of crimes in the country. State with increases and, above all, important reductions are appreciated. However, the constant is that the distribution of spending doesn't respond to objective criteria or priorities, but instead attends to inertia, or rather, political elements. The allocation of the budget, at least, seeks to maintain the level of spending of the Attorney General offices and the courts to cover the personnel, but is not enough to expand the installed capacity or to make innovations or improvements. The most affected institutions are those that exist to protect the rights of both victims and accused. These are practically invisible in the distribution of spending, widening asymmetries, leaving the parties without an adequate representation, and further, complicating the development of criminal proceedings in hearings. The budget factor compromises the operation and strengthening of institutions. Within Mexico, we have different Mexicos, and the ranking with which we evaluate the progress in the conditions for criminal justice is a clear example. This index establishes, with a progressive lens, the minimums that each state must establish to achieve a system operation. I am referring to elements of coordination, collaboration between institutions, rational allocation of spending, statistical information that allows timely monitoring, as well as elements towards a better governance in the sector, such as transparency and citizen participation. The ranking shows us, as Edna said, the gap we face as a country, with the standard for 2021 of 1,200 points. The national average barely reaches 500 points. In 2021, we observed that the gap between the states with the best conditions and the states that haven't finished yet to establish this made wider. In 2018, the difference between the state with the highest score and the one with the lowest was 296%. For 2021, this difference was 350%. Most of the country continues to operate in a fragmented manner. Briefly, these budget conditions, as well as the lack of coordination and planning, also impact the installed capacity of the institutions and their workloads. In Mexico, each prosecutor carries out an average of 169 investigations at the same time. Each forensic staff, 356 opinions. Each judge, 180 cases. Each public defender represents at the same time 271 persons. And each victim advisor, 157 people. These figures show how weak the institutions are when they are facing the demand for the service, and therefore to the detriment of its quality. Part of the elements that portray the current operation of criminal justice are related as well to the response of the state that seek, on the one hand, to reduce rights and liberties under the promise of greater security and justice. This narrative has been accepted by legislators and heads of institutions, which has led to regressive practices and with more room for arbitrariness. Such is example of a growing list of crimes for which it is possible to impose an automatic prison, pretrial detention, without any proof, without any analysis. This measure has increased the prison population awaiting sentencing by more than 30%, with a greater impact on women and people who didn't have access to an adequate defense. Another example is convictions through summary proceedings, or which in some states already reaches 80% of its resolutions. When the person has been in automatic prison without access to legal advice, it seems that they are encouraged to plead guilty in order to get their process concluded as soon as possible. We also observe Attorney General offices without the capacity to carry out effective investigations and aimed at closing or concluding cases with the least possible effort. Or the proposal of a National Guard of a military nature that operates instead of the civil police, and of which less than a third party has the certification on its competences. All this has resulted in a mosaic of procedural injustices and threats to rights and freedom, which instead of seeing the possibility of reducing it, it is appreciated with an encouragement to expand it. Although the system has a residual logic, some elements are observed in terms of attention. Here, three important ones. First, only 38% of the cases receive a response from the Attorney General offices, of which half are sent to the archive, waiting to receive information from the desk without pattern analysis and with the risk that prescribe the cases. Second, there is a waste of alternative solutions that are mostly designed to repair the damage. Only 8% are channeled to that route when they could even reach probably more than 35% of the cases. And the third one, without real mechanisms and tools for prioritization and differentiated attention, the probability of attention or clarification of cases is really very low. 4 facts about pretrial detention. First, 60% of the cases with this precautionary measure are imposed in a mandatory or automatic manner, without any analysis. Second, only 2 out of 10 people who have been in pretrial detention concluded their process with a conviction. Isn't this measure extremely burdensome? The third one, even though legally the term of pretrial detention shouldn't exceed 2 years, the truth is that at the end of this analysis, this study, there were almost 5,000 people in detention for more than 2 years expecting their sentencing. And fourth, pretrial detention is imposed more on women than on men. Locally, it is imposed in 1, rather 2 women, but at the federal level, they are 7 out of 10. And finally, we calculate a measure of impunity or the effectiveness of the justice system by considering the effective responses, whether in a form of a sentence, an alternative solution, or an early solution. In this sense, it is important to note that accumulated cases are analyzed. National impunity reached an average of 91.8%, almost 92%. However, 2/3 of the states exceed 90%, and the state with the lowest level reaches 69%. This measurement can give us a general idea about the resolution of the cases, but under the premise that institutions are exceed in capacity and demand for the service, we propose to measure impunity for specific crimes. About what we found in Impunity Index per crime. As you can see, the levels of impunity between cases of common crime with respect to crimes that involve life, liberty, or personal integrity are almost the same. Intentional homicides with almost 97% of impunity. Enforced disappearance is almost 99%. It is at this point that we believe that a differentiated and prioritized response could make a difference in terms of attention to the individual, but it could also optimize the use and exploitation of institutional resources. I would like to leave here some clues of our findings, and I would like to hear from you about concerns that we ourselves also have. For example, what should we minimally expect from the criminal justice system? Are there tolerable levels of impunity? What would be some of the main bets to be more effective and gain citizen trust? Thank you very much for your time. I give the floor to Denise González, Senior Researcher in Mexico Evalúa, who will moderate the conversation.
Thank you, please. We greatly appreciate the company of our speakers. Thank you very much, Douglas, Linda, and David, for joining us today to comment on our hallazgos report. Each of you will have 6 minutes to present your first impressions. And after each of you has intervened, we're going to have a second round of interventions of messages. So in these second round, you will also have 6 minutes each to either react to what another person has said, or maybe to add some elements of the discussion that you missed during your first intervention. In our private chat on the right side of the screen, we will let you know when you have 1 minute left, and we'll ask you to keep your cameras on while we are talking so that everyone can see us. After these 2 rounds of comments, we will have a Q&A session for 15 minutes so that the public that is watching us can join the conversation as well. So, Douglas, I'll leave the floor to you for your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Edna and the entire team at México Evalúa. This is an incredibly important report that your team has put together, and it's just an honor to be part of this panel and this discussion in general. The organization that I represent, Juvenile Justice Advocates International, our headquarters are actually in Mexico City. We work throughout the region, but primarily in Mexico on reducing the use of incarceration for youth who are in the justice system. And we have about 10 years of experience working with both federal authorities as well as various states throughout Mexico. And so our perspective and my perspective on the report that you've put out, and in general, the kind of advances in the criminal justice reform definitely comes from the perspective of working in the juvenile justice system in Mexico. So I think that's important to kind of understand our where we're coming from as an organization, and the specific experience or examples or kind of the lens through which we see the research that you've conducted. To that end, there's just a couple points I'd like to highlight from the report and from our experience that I think are important to understand. First, I want to take the opportunity to share a little bit more about the juvenile justice system in Mexico and how the report and more broadly the criminal justice reforms have impacted the juvenile justice system. Just so that everyone understands that the same reform process that the more broad criminal justice system underwent in Mexico, also the juvenile justice system also underwent the same reforms, as well as additional constitutional and legal reforms to ensure that the Mexican juvenile justice system was in line with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and Mexico's international obligations. This kind of was came to a culmination in the 2016 National Juvenile Justice Law in Mexico, the first National Juvenile Justice Law, which from a legal framework standpoint is probably one of the most progressive and pro-rights legal frameworks in the Western Hemisphere when it comes to juvenile justice, with really some transformative reforms that took place. Although similar to what México Evalúa has outlined for us, there are gaps and holes in the legal framework. There are also gaps and opportunities in the institutional framework that's resulted in and in its actual implementation. I think one of the important points to understand about that specific system is that the juvenile system requires that the system itself is a specialized juvenile system, which in terms in Latin America and in Mexico means that both the legal framework as well as the institutional arrangements and the operators of the system are specialized in juvenile justice, and there's kind of a line between what is the adult system and the juvenile system. And this is one of the areas of opportunities that we see in our work continually, that there tends to be either a lack of specialization in the legal framework at the state level, or in the actual operators of the system who are, in some cases, transferring between, correctional officers transferring between adult facilities and youth facilities, as well as, the other operators that Mexico Evalúa has outlined, from defense attorneys to prosecutors. And what we see as a result is a lot of bringing in of a more punitive adult kind of perspective into the youth system. And the same is true, unfortunately, we find in some cases when projects are coming into Mexico from the international funding community that are absolutely designed for the criminal justice system and the adult system, and that sometimes those practices by happenstance or request are expanded into the youth justice system, and we start to see kind of an eroding of that division. Things like the accreditation of facilities based on standards that are designed for the adult system, bringing in a perspective and a security focused perspective into facilities that ought to be focused on social reintegration and not punishment. The other main point I think that's important to call out is how, again, reflecting what you've seen in the report, how unevenly these laws and institutions are being implemented and funded across different states in Mexico. It's incredibly unevenly implemented. State laws that are designed to kind of bring about the full implementation and the institutional arrangements end up being applied very differently and sometimes inconsistent with the national legal framework. The lack of funding to certain agencies. And in particular, from our standpoint, with a lot of these reforms have brought in a significant focus on alternatives to incarceration, both pre-trial as well as post-sentence. And while in this, you saw from the graph, the vast majority of the funding or the balance of the funding is going to the security, public security agencies, we're not seeing that funding and that focus transfer outside of the walls of the incarceration facilities, of the prisons and youth detention. So into probation, into community-based services, reentry services, there's really a lack of focus on that side. And in the juvenile justice sector, that's become the vast majority of cases. So when you talk about impunity, you'll even see whole states where there's virtually no investment in community-based services or probation. And so, one of our concerns as an organization is not only the impunity that results, but for youth in the youth justice system who aren't even accused of a crime that warrants incarceration, that the public as a whole will lose faith in the justice system because of what's perceived as impunity, when the law itself is providing for responsibility or consequences, but they're just non-custodial measures. But the state and as well as the national government aren't providing the guidance and the resources necessary to ensure that those services are fully implemented. So from our perspective, those are some of the areas of real opportunity. And again, I really thank the whole team at Mexico Evalúa for the opportunity to participate in this very important discussion.
Thank you, Douglas. I'll give the floor to Linda, please. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you. Buenos dias. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's a true honor, and thank you also for producing this report with rich and important data about the criminal justice system in Mexico. I am myself working as a criminal lawyer in Norway, and this will also be my perspective. I think that the challenges that you address in the report are actually to some extent also visible here in Norway. And I also think they may probably be visible in any country, but to what degree may of course depend on the political willingness to invest in resources in the system, which in turn I think depend on the resources country has. So as a starting point, I would like to emphasize that I agree much with this emphasis of a system perspective in this report, and that the criminal justice system should work as a coherent and coordinated unity. I also believe that some kind of impunity may be unavoidable in any criminal justice system that is working under the rule of law. But I think also that it's really important here to distinguish between impunity that is following from so to say, insufficient intervention from the criminal justice agency, which the report underlines, and impunity that is unavoidable in any system, for instance, because of difficulty to prove that the accused person has committed a rape when there were no other witnesses than those involved. So the key questions that I think that the report addresses are then that, in a way, what level of impunity is tolerable in a society? And even more basically, how can we achieve a sufficiently efficient criminal justice system in this regard? And the report here speaks about the importance of securing a genuine justice or a genuine just criminal justice system. And I would like to elaborate briefly of how I conceive of such a system. So first, I think it's essential that we then have to return back to the basic constitutional values of human dignity, autonomy, and equality that underlies any democratic order, and that is the foundation for international declaration of human rights, such as the UN Declaration that was mentioned before. And I think that it's, in my view, that these values, these constitutional values, are the essential meaning of the criminal justice system. And the aim of the system is then to protect these values. And then the system has, so to say, a dual function. It has to protect individuals' rights from being violated by other individuals. That is to secure crime control, to secure that severe violation of people's life, health, and freedom are reacted upon and not left unpunished. But it also has to ensure that the public authority themselves do not violate these individuals' rights. So considering this dual function, I think that the specific norms, functions, and organizations of the system could then be further elaborated. And then we must consider how these principles could be transformed into more specific normative and institutional solutions at each functional level of the system. We could, for instance, think about the duties of the prosecutor when it comes to prioritizing certain crimes investigations over others. Or we can think about the standards for the use of pretrial detention or imprisonment. However, the overarching is how we can organize the interplay between the different system elements in order to secure that the system works precisely as an efficient and just system. And here I would just briefly want to emphasize three key aspects. First, and this is not so to say emphasized in the report, but I would like to consider or emphasize criminalization. That is that what acts that we are criminalize will actually decide the content and the focus of the system. And the criminal law should, in my view, be the last resort. And we must then carefully consider not to over-criminalize or overuse the criminal law as a social political instrument, because then we will easily end up with an overburdened system that will lose trust. So second, we must consider proportionality between the severity of the crime and the harshness of the response. And such proportionality also concerns precisely the differentiation between different responses. And finally, I think that we should aim at well-developed procedural standards and regulations to secure efficient crime investigations. So in sum, I think that to achieve a genuinely just system with a tolerable level of impunity, we must start to articulate the more basic aims of the system, that is the constitutional values of our society, and to build a system as a working whole around these. So therefore, I'm very pleased to see that the report emphasizes precisely these values. So thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Linda. David, are you there? You have 6 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, first of all, I'd like to, I'm David Shirk, as Denise mentioned. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations and the director of the Justice in Mexico program at the University of San Diego, which works directly on criminal justice reform in Mexico. And it's a huge pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to comment on the hallazgos report that México Evalúa has produced. This report is extremely rich. It's very well researched, and it makes an important contribution to our understanding of criminal justice, the criminal justice system in Mexico, and the efforts to try to improve it over the last, at this point, nearly 15 years since major reform was passed in 2008 to move from an old inquisitorial, the traditional inquisitorial or mixed inquisitorial model to the oral adversarial model that involves a number of significant modifications in criminal procedure that are intended to make the administration of justice in Mexico more transparent, more efficient, and hopefully more effective and just. I've had the opportunity to work closely with Edna, Christel, and Denise and their whole team for the last few months on a number of different projects, and I just want to congratulate them on their work in this area and also the several other areas that Mexico Evalúa works on that are so important, including public security, transparency, anti-corruption, and democratic and economic development more generally. I think México Evalúa is an example of how civil society plays a fundamental role in monitoring and holding to account government actors and government programs in areas that are critical for democratic governance in Mexico. So I want to start with my congratulations on this important report. And it's clear from this report, as we've seen in previous years from the hallazgos report, that the administration of justice in Mexico has serious deficits, that the rule of law in Mexico is woefully inadequate, that the criminal justice system is inefficient and ineffective in processing criminal cases, holding criminals to account. And unfortunately, what we've also learned, thanks to the hallazgos report, is the pace and depth of progress in Mexico's criminal justice reform efforts have been incredibly slow and unfortunately not particularly profound. And it's taking a long time to achieve many of the goals that criminal justice reformers have had in Mexico for really, more than a decade now in their efforts to achieve change. The hallazgos report gives us some hard numbers to better understand the problems, and I think that first and foremost, what we know from this report and from much other evidence is just how much distrust there is in the criminal justice system, how little confidence there is, and how much frustration there is with the functioning of Mexico's criminal justice system. So that's great because we all agree that the system is not working to everyone's satisfaction. When you have less than 1 in 10 crimes even reported, pretty much across the board, it's clear that you can't hold people to account for crimes that are not even reported, but people don't want to report crimes, obviously, because they feel a lack of confidence that the system and the Mexican authorities will do anything about it. So this has been a kind of catch-22 in Mexico for the last 2 decades. Is how do you restore confidence in the system and get people to report crimes on the one hand, if you, on the other hand, don't have the mechanisms in place to actually deal with those crimes effectively. The distrust basically reflects the fact, though, that while the old system, the traditional mixed inquisitorial system in Mexico is dead, the old practices continue. Criminal impunity is a serious problem. Even among those crimes that are reported, we see very high rates of criminal impunity across many different categories of crime. There's some variation across crimes and across different geographic areas and states at the subnational level. But as a general rule, when we look at any given crime in Mexico, it is more likely than not that crime will not be resolved, and that's a problem. I do think we have to look carefully and more longitudinally at impunity data. Often what happens is we look at the number of crimes that were resolved in a particular year, and what we really need is a little bit more of a longitudinal perspective, because for so many crimes that are reported in a given year, we need more of maybe a 5-year time frame to look at how those criminal investigations play out. Because obviously a murder investigation can take months. It may not get logged if you find a suspect and begin the prosecution of that suspect. It may take a year, 2, 3 years, even here in the U.S. So I think we have we really need authorities to make more of an effort to make it easier to track the movement of criminal cases through the tunnel of the criminal justice system if we want to have a better handle on that problem. But thanks to the hallazgos report, we do see that there's been improvement. According to their impunity index, the national average is about 91.8% criminal impunity, which is 3 points lower than what we saw 91.8% in 2001 is about 3 percentage points lower than in 2020. So we really do, it is possible to move the needle, and hopefully it's moving in a positive direction. Another issue that's brought up, I just want to see how much time I have here. 1 minute. Oh my gosh. Well, okay. So I'm going to wrap up then very quickly here and just say, there are a number of other issues that we can talk about. I know we'll get another bite at the apple on this. But I want to just say 2 last things then. The first is that I think the report is super helpful in that it gives us a sense of the areas where we need to prioritize our efforts. As some of the other commentators have mentioned, there are clearly some deficits that need to be addressed immediately. And I would point to the deficits that we see in Mexican prosecutorial offices in terms of not only the number of personnel, but the quality of personnel that they have, both on the prosecutorial side and the criminal investigation side, and the resources that they have to do their job, resources and training that they have to do their jobs effectively. The second thing I'll say is just that, as I said at the beginning, it's clear that we need Mexico to have a strong civil society sector and organizations like Evalúa that can play a role in monitoring and evaluating the progress that's made, and especially to do so over a long period of time. Because whereas administrations may come and go over a 3 or a 6 year period, organizations like Evalúa can keep their eye on the ball for the long term. These reports have been coming out over the last 10 years. We're going to need them to keep coming out over the next 10, 20, 30 years, because this is a generational change that we're trying to achieve in Mexico's criminal justice system. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. So listening to you, I can see that your comments highlight the fact that punishment continues to be at the core, right, of what it is commonly or popular perceptions about what justice should be. And related to that, a lot of assumptions about what the criminal justice system should or should not be doing. And Linda, you talked about how the criminal justice system should protect basic human values, right? But it is still commonly perceived that it is a zero-sum game, right? Opposite to what Christel was saying at the beginning of her presentation. So there are still a lot of people that think that rights, it is acceptable to undermine rights to achieve certain results, right? And then, David, you talk about, what some of the failures, the flaws of the system, and how it is evident that the system, and you said, is not working, the lack of confidence, old practices that continue. And there is also a very, very, a very uncomfortable question about what levels of impunity are tolerable. And I would like to, I don't know if in this second round of comments, of course, you can react to what everybody has said, but what in a context like Mexico, what are those levels of impunity? What are those acceptable levels of impunity? Or how should we address this question when we have, I don't know, enforced disappearances, a lot of torture being still committed. We have this very high rates of homicides, and Christel gave a lot of the data, right? So how should we approach our context? Based on that evidence that the Hallazgos report has pulled together, what should be some of those next steps? And David, you talked a little bit about this, and I love the phrase, it is possible to move the needle. So I don't know if in your comments, Linda and Douglas, can you say a little bit about this? So what areas should be prioritized? And of course, we have a lot of questions coming in already. I will leave those to the Q&A session. So for now, I would like to give Douglas the floor again for 6 minutes. Douglas, if you can, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me attempt to respond to the question of kind of what level of impunity is acceptable. And I mean, looking at the numbers and knowing kind of the capacity of the system itself, the reality is that if every single crime was reported, investigated, prosecuted, the system would be completely overwhelmed and collapse in Mexico. That's the reality. And so it's got the justice system, the criminal justice system is a response to crime, but it is not the solution. It has to go hand in hand with other social interventions that are getting at the root causes of crime. It's got to go hand in hand. It has to start creating a virtuous cycle. You know, specifically when we think about, you know, in our work in the juvenile sector, working with youth, it's maybe you see it in a little bit more explicit way, but thinking about other systems that young people come in contact with, the education system, the labor, you know, the labor force, the employment systems, the family protection systems and child protection systems, you know, all of these systems have to be working in concert. And that gets to the larger kind of the larger scope of the same problem that you're highlighting in the report, and this lack of coordination. The idea that the criminal justice system itself shouldn't be a set of siloed institutions. It should be coordinating their activities, and we're not seeing that right now. We're not seeing that in Mexico. We're not seeing that from the federal government coordinating with the state governments. We're not seeing that in the state governments coordinating between agencies that are responsible for the execution of justice. And then we're certainly not seeing that, our experience in the juvenile system, we're certainly not seeing coordination between the juvenile justice system and institutions like the child protective system, the DIF, the child welfare system in Mexico, places where, you know, there's great need. and these systems are not talking to each other, are not engaging. In some cases, not kind of accepting their legal responsibilities that they have. So it's to that extent, it's broader than the criminal justice system to be addressing these societal issues, and looking at what the goal is. I mean, I take the point that there is a clear perception in the public at large and very embedded in certain institutions in the criminal justice system that incarceration, locking someone behind bars, is justice. That's what justice is. And if that doesn't happen, it's impunity. I mean, I've read newspaper opinions in Mexico saying that, sometimes impunity is a good thing. We need to have probation or to that extent of saying if someone's not locked up, that is the same as impunity. When we look at alternative justice mechanisms, I mean, these are mechanisms that Mexico is going to have to rely on to deal with different types of crime, so that the system isn't completely bogged down and people aren't spending years and years in pretrial detention waiting for cases to process through the system. So it's a very sticky set of interconnected issues. One thing that we've seen very clearly, however, is that there's a huge appetite at the state level for more coordination. The most recent example I can think of in our case is we coordinate with the federal government to provide information to state governments on how state juvenile justice institutions should respond to the COVID pandemic. And when they were getting virtually no other direction. And in the first 3 months of the pandemic, we were hosting webinars with 500 or 600 government officials joining to talk about these issues amongst themselves. And so there is a real appetite at the state level, not everywhere, not universally speaking, but broadly speaking, for coordination and guidance. And I think that we're not seeing, as much as we haven't seen that leadership to the extent we've needed it from the federal level, we're seeing that less now. And maybe there's some opportunities for the state governments to, and the state actors to coordinate kind of amongst themselves, share good practices. There's no one state has good practices in every area, but there are good practices happening at the state level in Mexico. And if there's better coordination amongst themselves, we can still, like David said, we can still move the needle and see the needle continue to be moved. That kind of leads into the next piece that we've been seeing and struggling with, and I think is really pertinent to this discussion, the fact that this discussion is very important, and I think the most important actor that should be listening to this discussion, the authorities at the federal level who are making decisions about funding and coordination, unfortunately, may or may not be part of this discussion, right? Not be listening to this discussion. So those of us who are engaged in this discussion, civil society, the funding community, some state actors, what can we do to continue to move the needle in absence of stronger national leadership to push these things forward? And so I think that's an important question. And I want to echo David's comment that civil society in Mexico on this topic is incredibly important, and say that Mexico is incredibly blessed with a huge number of very excellent civil society organizations and experts, specifically in the criminal justice sector. But the organizations tend to be at high risk, or I don't want to say that they're weak. That sounds like a judgment against the organizations, but the reality is that how these organizations are funded more than anything results in them oftentimes not having the sustainability or the consistent interaction that the capacity is there for. The experts are there at the civil society level, but it's vulnerable to the funding mechanisms, really. I mean, that's the bottom line. And so if we can continue to work on that part of the problem, I think that's something that maybe is more achievable. And then those actors in Mexico can start to take, a firmer, continue to take a firm leadership role, but have that kind of sustainability and strengthening of the institutions that they're a part of. So.
Thank you. Linda, I'll give you the floor for another 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. And I will also try to answer. I mean, I do not have the inside perspective that you have, of course. So I do not have the experience of the Mexican criminal justice system. So, but I would like still to pick up on what you asked for, like what should we prioritize next? And I also would like to relate to what Douglas emphasized, as I understood you, that this is also a matter of how we conceive of justice and criminal justice, and of the role of criminal justice. And again, why I emphasized also that the criminal justice system should be the last resort is because I think that it is really important that we are discussing the criminal justice system in relation to what we can achieve outside the criminal justice system and before the criminal justice system enters the scene. And I think that we are, at least I think, also here in the Nordic countries, we're maybe in a tendency where there is an overfocus of the criminal justice system as a kind of preventive or a tool for achieve crime prevention, solve social problems, and so on. And I think that, in my view, the criminal justice system, in a way, any society's proof of failure. And I think that it is, in a way, it's reactive. And when it, and relating to the area of juvenile justice, we also see that in Norway. I'm also working in that area here in Norway. And we see, so to say, that often when the problems are so large, so that a juvenile enters into the criminal justice system, much could have been done before. So I think, and also what Douglas pointed at, that if any crime should be followed up and investigated into, then the system would be overburdened. There are not resources, I think, in any criminal justice system to do that. We see in any system, also here in Norway, we see, which is a much smaller country with a different resource situation, we still see that there is a need to prioritize certain crimes over others. There are some minor crimes like theft of bikes after student parties or others that will never be investigated or even reported. So I think, ideally, I think that one should start out from, in one way, from a realistic resource picture. That is, that given the resources we have, what is the best we can achieve? And I think also that is also why I emphasized criminalization, because I think that, and also the level of sentences and the use of imprisonment and so on, because it's also a matter of what resources can you invest in a society by the use of punitive measures versus what resources can you invest in society in, for instance, emphasizing to give resources to, for instance, people living in poverty, children living in poverty, marginalized families, etc., to invest in their situation, invest in crime prevention long before a crime happens. And I think to think about criminal justice not isolated as only, because criminal justice has to do with how we deal with crime or crime prevention outside criminal justice. So I would say, and this so what I think one should think of as next step is rather first to think of, within the resource situation we have, what is the best we can do? What are the most serious? And then I would say one need to prioritize the most serious crime first. Those that could not be left without a reaction. Also in a term of that, I think may sometimes be a need for any society to say that this was really a serious action that we will, so to say, respond to by showing that we are actually not accepting this. I think that is maybe the reactive role of the system. But I think to prioritize, and again, I would emphasize a human rights perspective as a sort of guidance for, so to say, prioritization if we only could put this amount of resources? Do we rather want murder to be prioritized, or do we now I'm of course simplifying things, but I think we should relate to basic values again. What are at stake here? What do we concern the most for? What are the most important things in our society? And just to say that regarding how, I mean, crimes can also be committed by state agencies. So to use torture or to violate human rights, if you're doing it in the name of public authorities or the name of justice, does not matter from my perspective. It is also something that should not be left unpunished. So, and I think this is to create trust for the whole system is for me a matter to take people's rights and state seriously. And I think yeah. So and also I would like to relate a little maybe question back to you, because I found one thing in your presentation interesting in this regard, and that was this, as I understood Christel, I think it was her, she said that there has been now a little increase in the number of reported crimes, or which one could interpret in two ways. First, is this an indication that there are more crimes? Or is it an indication that it's more trust in the system? Or both, maybe. And I think this is because if it's the latter, I mean, then we really have a momentum to move the needle. Was that the expression? And I think because then we have to work with this trust, because trust is really important for any legal order to have. And I think if that is the issue, if it's more crime reported, then we may end up in even more overburdened system, so to say, if we are not thinking about the resources. So yeah, I don't know, is cannot, as you see, give any simple answer. I think there are no simple answers, and I think, and like these resources, it boils down to resources, but it also boils down to a principle, in my view, thinking about where should we put the resources if we have to choose, and then a allocation and coordination of resources to do the best we can do, given the values that we would like to protect with this system, and given that this system should not be the first resort in society, it should be the last resort. And much problems, in my view, should be solved outside and long before this system has to act.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. David, I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
So on the last couple of comments, I mean, I think it's clear that justice has a price, and Mexico is, I would say, it's not just a question of what do we prioritize given our existing budget for justice administration in Mexico, but I think that Mexico is not investing the necessary amount of funding in its criminal justice system, and especially not investing in the areas where it is most needed to ensure accountability. So, for example, the system that they're implementing is a system in which accountability is to be achieved by strengthening due process protections for the accused, in basically raising the bar for prosecutors by empowering public defenders to challenge evidence and to question whether or not the authorities have followed due process. And when public defenders are receiving a fraction of the funding that prosecutors are receiving, and those prosecutors are themselves underfunded, it's clear that we're not prioritizing a key component of accountability in the system. And I think that's one thing that comes through in the hallazgos report. And again, it's critically important to note in the report, if I'm reading it correctly, due to internal restructuring and budget cuts, there was a 40% decrease in the personnel in Mexico's federal prosecutor's office from 2019 to 2020. And what the current government of Mexico at the national level has done is to try to dramatically reduce spending across the board in ways that I think sometimes fail to take into account where the priorities are, and starving the beast of the Mexican criminal justice system or any other areas of government, which seems to be the goal of the current administration in order to fund social welfare programs, is maybe not the best approach. I mean, we're basically, I think Mexico's government is thinking about how to prioritize with a fixed pie mentality. We're going to need to take from this area to subsidize this other area. When in reality, what Mexico's government needs to do is to grow the pie, to grow the amount of resources that are being directed to the entire criminal justice system. And that may mean fiscal reform and rethinking how we fund public security, and finding ways to increase the ability of the government to invest in key areas. I do want to say two or three other quick things. One is I'm worried, one of the things that we haven't mentioned so far is the increased use of salidas alternas under the new criminal justice system. The new criminal justice system creates mechanisms for greater prosecutorial discretion in what crimes they are going to pursue. And this comes down to this question of impunity tolerance. Are we interested in prosecuting every single criminal equally and bringing every criminal actor to justice? Or do we care more about murderers than we do bicycle thieves? More about rapists than we do, shoplifters? And I think we have to, there's a comment by Sonia Chetumal saying that, we should, it's not about the percentage of impunity tolerance. It's about making sure that we reduce corruption and pursue good practices in crime prevention. But the reality is that prosecutors must and do have some discretion about what crimes they prosecute in the new system, and they also have the ability to quickly and efficiently resolve cases through plea bargaining, and that's great as long as we have confidence in the level of integrity and professionalism in our prosecutors, which I think we have to be careful about in any system, but especially one where corruption is well known to exist, as is the case in Mexico. But it's also, it's critical if you're going to have plea bargaining and prosecutorial discretion that there is a strong criminal defense to ensure that the rights of the accused are being respected. We just don't have that. If I can squeeze in two last points, I'll just say, as Linda pointed out, state actors can also be criminals. And the report mentions that there's a 100% impunity rate on torture cases in Mexico. And so that's an area where more light needs to be shined. Another aspect that I think the report doesn't really get into, and I think we're all somewhat remiss for addressing in the work that's being done now on justice reform in Mexico, and that is that the Ley General de Víctimas of 2013 provides special rights and protections for victims. But that's a huge unfunded mandate. There are very few programs and resources and even attempts to monitor and evaluate whether victims are getting the support they need to seek resolution of their situation. I think there's more work we can do there. Last thing I want to say is PTA President Claire Selke and Michelle Orozco both make this point. They want to know where have there been some best practices in Mexico. And I think it's critical to note that you've got places like Querétaro and Nuevo León, where consistently in the hallazgos reports, they have been performing at a very high level. But if you look carefully at the hallazgos ideal standard, that snail-shaped graphic that we've been shown in this presentation, there's a noticeable difference between the top 10 or so states and the bottom 10 or so states. And that difference in those top 10 states and bottom 10 states, there's a stark contrast in the level of economic development in those states and the degree of indigeneity in those states. States that are more indigenous, states that have lower levels of socioeconomic development are at the bottom of that graph, and the states that are more economically developed. And generally speaking, with Yucatan as an exception, the top performing states tend to have higher levels of economic development and fewer marginalized groups such as Mexico's indigenous people. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So we have a bunch of questions, but we're also running out of time. So what I suggest is just addressing a couple for you to comment like in a minute or so. I know that it's very difficult to answer almost existential questions about justice in 1 minute, but maybe we can try and then we can wrap up. So there are a couple of questions regarding the level of progress that has been achieved across states. To that, I'll just say that if you go to the report and to the reports that have been published in previous years, you will be able to see that Querétaro, Nuevo León, and Coahuila have achieved some level of progress consistent from one year to the other. Also, just in the case of Nuevo León, there has been a party change, so that is an interesting fact. And there are a couple of questions. So one of them is, what should be the primary role for law enforcement agencies in the criminal justice system? And I would add, how can we break this historical relationship between the executive power and prosecutors' offices? As you know, in Latin America, there has been a tendency to establish the autonomy of the prosecutors' offices. So how can we break this historical ties that still influence the quality of the criminal justice system in Mexico? So 1 minute, please. Douglas, can you comment on that? I think you're muted. We're not listening.
Sorry, I don't know if I'm the best position to comment on those pieces, but what I can certainly say is that what we've observed is it more at a state level than maybe being able to comment kind of at the federal level and the independence of the prosecutor's office. But it does definitely seem to be, from at least anecdotally from what we've seen, that the more the operators and the heads of agencies, whatever the agency, the prosecutor's office or attorney general's office, the public security, or we're working in the juvenile justice system. So the director of the juvenile, the juvenile detention centers or at those levels, the longer kind of the more stability that there is in those positions, kind of the more they're viewed as, kind of having a civil service orientation as opposed to a political appointee orientation, and the more consistency that there is tends to be the places where we see that progress taking root. Now, I haven't worked in Nuevo León or Querétaro, so I can't speak to those states in particular, but other states, either where that just absolutely does not exist, where there's huge turnover, and not only between administrations, but during administrations when there's a lot of turnover and instability, the professionalism of those roles just kind of disappears. So any agency, we see that there's some level of consistency and kind of that independence. We see a lot more progress. And then those pieces, whether it's in the prosecutor's office, in the probation office, in the prison or detention facilities themselves, tends to survive better once it's been better established, those turnovers at that point. So that's probably the best place that the best way I can kind of get at that particular question from the perspective that we have.
Thank you. Linda?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, it's a difficult to answer very quick, but I understood your question to how to secure the independency of the prosecutor, and I think, it is no straightforward answer, but I would like to emphasize that one may think more to articulate what is the aim of the prosecutor's job role. So, and I would say, and to articulate that more in substantive terms, that is, the aim is to investigate crimes according to, like, in a search for what we can call some kind of substantive truth. That is, to find out who has committed crime and find those who are guilty for this, but also not to punish those that are not guilty. And there, at least in the Norwegian system, there is such quite large emphasis on the principle of objectivity for the prosecutor. That is, that there is a duty to investigate into all sides of a case, in particular to make sure that one is not, so to say, prosecuting if there is not good enough evidence. So that it is the aim of precisely finding out if there is a crime committed or not, and if there is a person guilty for this or not. And this, so to say, the principle of truth in this procedure relates to this ideal that the prosecutor should have a duty to be objective. It should not be biased. It should look into all sides of a case. It should lift all stones and not have a specific, so to say, agenda to punish in this way or another, but the agenda should be precisely to find out. Because a criminal justice system must must be, so to say, target those that it should target, but it should not target those that are innocent. So this principle of objectivity, and to articulate more like the role of the prosecutor more independently, and what is it precisely that we have a prosecutor to do. And I think that may be a way of thinking in this way of trying to create a better independency and division of function in the system. But again, there is no easy answer, and it's difficult to give a quick answer, as you see.
Thank you, Linda. And David?
So one thing that's, if we want to think about prosecutorial independence, there's definitely variation at the state level. Some states have fully independent prosecutors or fiscalías. Others still have are directly appointed by and can be dismissed by the executive. And so it's a great natural experiment. We just need to do, I think, more research on how that variation on the independent variable, whether or not you have some measure of prosecutorial independence, has resulted in substantive differences in certain dependent outcome variables, such as the number of cases brought to trial, or juicios llevado a juicio, the use of plea bargaining, and whether or not cases are successfully brought to a sentence. And so that's a great México Evalúa future research project, or some graduate student future research project. But that's it. I think one thing, just talking to some state prosecutors and people doing work in this area, there are several obstacles to prosecutorial independence, which may not be apparent even if you have nominally independent prosecutors, including a lack of fiscal independence in some cases, executive interference in obtaining federal support through programs like FASP. Even if you're independent, you may need the governor's signature to request federal funds for a grant from the federal government. And so I think that there's multiple layers to this question that we really need to dig into a little bit more. But at the end of the day, as Linda mentioned, I think it depends on what our goals are. I certainly believe that prosecutors who are not independent, who enjoy a close working relationship with the executive branch, can be effective in bringing crimes to justice. And I think we just need to look more carefully at what's actually happening and sort of identify some of the patterns and best practices. So there's plenty of work to be doing in that area.
Thank you, David. So we have run out of time, unfortunately. So I have the responsibility to close this panel, and I will do so not by trying to synthesize all your very thoughtful comments, but by thanking you all for joining México Evalúa in this conversation. It really has been a great honor to have the opportunity to talk to you about all these big questions that torment our minds every day when we try to achieve progress in the criminal justice system here in Mexico. So I will, of course, thank you. And we look forward to having more opportunities to continue with this conversation. And I would also like to thank again our donors for supporting our work. Of course, those who follow México Evalúa's work every day. And of course, our sincere thanks to all of you who have joined this event and who have joined this conversation through our social media and Facebook and YouTube. So thank you very much. And I don't know, Christel, if Edna want to add something else? You're muted, Edna.
Okay, it's okay now. I just would like to thank all of you for your very valuable insights. It was really a pleasure to hear that we are in the same page regarding the goals and values that criminal justice system should pursue. And you make me think that it has been worth to work on this for so many years. So thanks a lot. But I would like, saying that, I would like to acknowledge that that these values has been stressed, particularly in the last years, as Christel pointed out in her presentation. And I'm quite concerned about the future of the system. As you know, we will have elections next year, so campaigns will start, and I think that militarism, punitive populism, strong hand will be at the heart of the debates, and that worries me a lot. So I think that our main challenge, as Anders pointed out in their welcome remarks, is how to reach Mexican public with evidence, with arguments about that there's no sense in turning back to the old model. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think it should be a priority for our work. So thanks a lot again. And I really want to thank the team, the México Evalúa team, Christel, Denise, and all of the team that made possible this debate. Thanks a lot. Bye.